Hey, this is Jeremy Wallace, Microsoft Certified Azure Solutions Architect Expert and Senior Cloud Infrastructure Engineer for Safari Micro. Today is our second video on AZ-140, configuring and operating Microsoft Azure Virtual Desktop. This unit, for this video, we're covering Azure Virtual Desktop Components. So let's dive right in. All right, so Azure Virtual Desktop Service Architecture is similar to RDS, Remote Desktop Services, or terminal services before that, if you're familiar with it. So in an RDS environment, you're going to see a lot of these same components. That's because the AVD evolved really from RDS. Microsoft took what was RDS technology and really evolved it for the cloud and built in these back-end components that use the same RDS components. So you're going to see these things that are familiar. These components that are listed here are part of the AVD control plane. That's all in the background. You don't manage it. This is what Microsoft manages. So they show in this diagram, this diagram from Microsoft. So it shows that Microsoft will manage the PaaS backend, and then you manage all of these things, which we'll dive into. On the PaaS backend, on the AVD control plane, you got the gateway, connection broker, license server, web access. And so it's important to know what some of these components are. Even though you don't manage it, Microsoft does, it's important to know what they do, because some of the things that you can do in the environment do affect these things, or you can make use of these things. So the web access component, that is what allows people to be able to access their virtual desktop or remote desktop application, or their remote application through an HTML5 capable browser. So that's going to be any Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari browsers that are HTML5 capable, and you can access that really from any device that has those browsers on, and can make use of things like MFA with Azure Active Directory or Entra ID at this point. Gateway, so the gateway service, that's what your devices that are remote are connecting to in order to get to their AVD environment. I have a small graph to kind of show that component here. So we have an Azure tenant. This is Azure Virtual Network, and I do have an AVD host pool with 2 session hosts in it. This icon here represents that gateway service. Again, I don't manage it. You can't manage it. You can't do anything to really affect it directly. That's all Microsoft. And the remote users, say they're accessing from a laptop or a tablet or a phone, they're connecting using the Microsoft Remote Desktop application. That's different from RDP. This is a dedicated application for connecting to things like AVD and Windows 365. So that's going to create an outbound connection going out from the client to the gateway service. And then Azure Orchestration creates a connection from the host to the gateway service as well. So they meet in the middle here to establish a connection. So there's not a direct connection one way in or out. So we call this in the AVD world reverse connect. So outbound secure connection to the gateway service, outbound secure connection from the host, meeting in the gateway service here. It's important to know about this because there are some things that you can do to disrupt this connection. So if there are issues and errors, you may see errors connecting to the gateway service because of something that's being blocked outbound wise from the device, or say you had a custom route table inside your Azure Virtual Network that's assigned to that AVD subnet. That could potentially disrupt the connection to the gateway service as well. So it's important to know where it is and how things get connected to it, because it's possible for you to break it depending on what you do in AVD. Other components that are in here, the connection broker service. So the connection broker service manages user connections to the virtual desktop and remote apps, and also provides load balancing and reconnection to existing sessions. So that connection service, say one user's already logged into one of these session hosts, their profile's connected to this host, they leave, they're still logged into the server, but they leave, so their session gets disconnected, they come back from lunch, say, and they try to reconnect to the virtual desktop. That session service will reconnect them to their existing logged in profile on that session host. And so that's an important functionality. Also load balancing. So there's different ways to load balance an AVD, whether it's to put as many users on a single session host before putting them on another, or spreading them out over multiple session hosts. That's something that's important for the connection broker to handle. Diagnostics. Remote desktop diagnostics are an event-based aggregator that marks each user or administrator action on the AVD deployment as success or failure. Administrators can query the event aggregation to identify failing components. So there are diagnostics to be able to see if there are things that are failures or successes. In fact, there's a whole section of insights that you can run on your AVD environments to be able to know things like users connected to it, the efficiency of your AVD session host, and those are things I can get in on in a future video. But a great feature of working with AVD environments too. Extensibility components. Azure Virtual Desktop includes several extensibility components. You can manage Azure Virtual Desktop using Windows PowerShell or with the provider REST APIs, which also enable support for third-party tools. So this is important because there are some great third-party tools that can take advantage of managing AVD environments, or organizations like Safari Micro, the company that I work for. We have a whole virtual desktop service offering that's based on AVD, building fully automated and managed AVD environments for users, and we use a third-party connection to be able to manage and orchestrate that. So there's the accessibility components are a huge advantage to engineers such as myself to be able to do things like that. But you can also leverage Windows PowerShell to do some automated scripting yourself directly in AVD. Components that you manage, these are things that you're responsible. So for the Azure Virtual Network, where the session hosts live. So you build out that virtual network, connections that come in and out of it. You can control with NSGs and route tables. So you manage that. And then you may want to connect that. Say you want to connect it to your on-prem environment, where you have file servers and other applications and printers and things that you want your virtual desktop users to interact with. And you can connect that either through a site-to-site VPN, say you're using the Azure Virtual Network Gateway to natively in Azure create a site-to-site VPN to your on-premise firewall, or you can use a firewall application that you can deploy there. Sophos, Fortinet, they have virtual firewalls that you can deploy to Azure, or you can use at the ISP level an express connection that connects your on-prem environment to your virtual network at the ISP level. And so that gives you greater throughput and connection control. And so enterprise environments may want to utilize this. But for small to mid-sized companies, that site-to-site VPN works just fine. Most of my clients that I work with, we implement site-to-site VPNs. Um, in fact, we had one client that deployed an express route, really saw no advantage for them, and went back to the site-to-site VPN. But it all depends. Every organization is unique. Some of the identity components, this is something that you have to manage. So Azure AD, so for identity access and management, Azure AD, or I guess is now Entra ID, is a key component for subscribing to a virtual desktop or a virtual application that's there. You can take advantage of things like MFA, multi-factor authentication, conditional access. So whether you want users to access their virtual desktop only from within the office, or they can't access it outside of the United States, or you want to make sure that they get an MFA prompt when they're accessing from outside the office. Those are all things that you can do with the Entra ID, Azure AD identity, and its integration with the Azure Virtual Desktop. The session hosts themselves need to be domain joined. So Active Directory domain services is where that comes into play. So whether that's an on-prem Active Directory, or you have a domain controller virtualized in Azure purely for the use of AVD, that those session hosts need to be joined to some type of Active Directory domain. Another domain service that you can use that's not listed here, but it is possible to use, is Azure Active Directory Domain Service. So that is a serverless domain services service provided by Azure that you can join to. So you can join servers to it just as you would Active Directory domain services. You can create group policies, manage DNS, create OU structures, all of that just the same as you would in Active Directory domain services, although there are limitations to that, and we might get into that in a future video. Operating systems that can be used with your session host: Windows 10 Enterprise, Windows 11 Enterprise, Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session. So the difference here is for personal desktops where you just have a server, essentially a Windows 10 server or Windows 11 server assigned directly to one individual, as opposed to Windows 10 or Windows 11 multi-session, which allows you to put multiple people onto a single session host. And that's really where I see a lot of the monetary benefits of AVD is in multi-session technology. So I always recommend people to take advantage of multi-session and pack as many people as you can onto individual session hosts to get the most out of them, because really no one's utilizing typically a session host to the 100% of its capability. In fact, there's usually a lot of rest period downtime for each individual user. So, and with just small spurts of using CPU utilization or RAM. And so when you spread that out across multiple people, you're really maximizing your utilization of a single session host, which you're paying for. So you're really getting more bang for your buck when you do that. And so it lowers your per user per cost on a monthly basis when you pack people on a multi-session. But there are cases where you need to use a personally assigned virtual desktop, one session host to one user, and we can get into those scenarios in the future. You can do Windows Server 2012 R2 or above, and so that's more of a traditional RDS type setup, but using AVD technology. In those cases, you do still have to use a RDS licensing role, and so it can get more complicated. And then there's a custom Windows system images with preloaded apps, group policies, and other customs. So you can create your own images that are based on these that you preloaded with certain settings and applications. In fact, that's a preferred approach to AVD environments, is have a golden image that you can deploy out to those session hosts. And then you can choose VM sizes, including GPU-enabled VMs. Each session host has an AVD host agent, which registers the VM as part of the AVD workspace or tenant. Each host pool can have one or more app groups, which are collections of remote applications or desktop sessions that users can access. So this is these are components that are more management than anything when you're dealing with them. Users assigned to specific pools and groups that have access to certain full virtual desktop experiences or just the remote applications that are being published from them. So you got the Azure Virtual Desktop Workspace. The AVD Workspace or tenant is a management construction to manage and publish host pool resources. So you got the host pool. You got the workspace, you got the host pool, you got the app groups. Those are all components that are more management than anything, but you do some configuration on the host pool and the app groups. And we can dive into that in the future. But that is an overview of all the components in AVD for this unit. And so, again, if you have any questions, feel free to comment on these videos. But do follow me as we continue to cover each of the units of AZ-140. All right, thanks.